Good day, everyone who is in the European time zone, and good morning or good evening, depending on where you're logging in. A warm welcome from me as the CDR Senior Expert for Project Development in Calm Future. It's my honor today to host this webinar, and I have a packed panel of great expertise with me. So for the next 60 minutes, you have a unique opportunity to get exposure to the full certification chain from the start towards the end. You can ask questions and inquire what's the most relevant for your operations that you might aim to do or that you might just be looking for information. I'll spend a few minutes now on housekeeping before I introduce our expert panel, so you know what to do. During this webinar, the key point is for you to ask for information. So I would kindly ask you to, right from the start, collect what kind of questions you have, write them in the chat in the Zoom, or submit them via the Q&A feature of Zoom, so we can jointly look at these and see which of the questions are the most relevant. This webinar lives from your input and inquiries, so the more you ask, the more you can benefit from this. As always, our webinars will be provided to you as a recording afterwards, so you will receive the link to access the video afterwards via email. For more information always on this webinar, but also others, you can follow Calm Future on LinkedIn, but you can also subscribe to our newsletter, which you can find a QR code at the end of this webinar or via our website. You'll get more access to more information, documents, but also future events that might be interesting for you. But now I would like to open this to our honored webinar panelists and give them a small space to introduce themselves. We start from left to right with Benno. Also, we have Neil with us from Isometric and Patricia from CSI. But maybe, Benno, you want to give us a first start and give a short introduction.
Yes, very happy to. Hello, everybody. Pleasure to be meeting you, calling in today from NASDAQ's London head offices. Our main investors. I usually reside in Munich, Germany, and I'm the Chief Operating Officer for Puro. My main responsibilities at Puro are basically what we call the certification journey. So the second that you submit your documents to us until you receive the full issuance of your credits, which we call corks. These are the teams that I'm working with, from the first initial eligibility checks to scheduling audits, conducting audits, the underlying registry, and the product side. I was also asked to give a quick glimpse into what Puro does. Wanting to keep it relatively high level, but just to give you a bit of my perspective on where we are. Puro, as you know, is the currently largest and longest existing standard carbon crediting platform and registry that's focusing purely on carbon removal, so on the engineered side. We've been around since 2019. Meanwhile, have a good 100 projects certified. We're conducting this year around 100 audits, so that's pretty much gives an insight into the number of throughput we're doing per year. We do have projects from basically every region across 6 methodologies. The key methodologies certainly being biochar, BECCS, stacks, and also working quite a lot on enhanced rock weathering, on carbonate materials, and terrestrial storage of biomass. Our focus has always been quality first, and being as quick as possible, but not making any trade-offs between quality and speed. So we really try to focus on the key thing. That's maybe something I will be mentioning throughout some of the answers today, possibly that carbon removals live from nothing but trust, and that's exactly what we are trying to bring in by giving our stamp and certifying carbon credits, bringing buyers that may not have the full understanding of what you, dear visitors or the spectators of this meeting, are doing. They might understand that in a lot of detail, so we want to give a stamp and make this as credible and trustworthy as possible. I'll leave it here. I would like to pass it on to my fellow panelists.
Thanks a lot, Benno. Neil, can you give us a small introduction to you and what Asymmetric is doing for exciting things in the CDR space?
Yes, of course. So great to see everyone. My name's Neil. I'm the head of the partnerships team at Isometric. So I oversee all the commercial work we do with project developers, both in the engineered and nature-based spaces, because we now work in both of those. And I've been here for about 3 years. Isometric itself is about 3.5 years old. And when we were founded, there were kind of two key characteristics that we wanted to invest a lot of resourcing in. The first was on the technical side. So we have from the very beginning had a large science team. Today it's about 15 people full time who drive protocol development and are also on hand to do, help with clarifications that come up in the verification process to make sure that runs as smoothly as possible. And the other one was technology. So software engineering is actually the biggest team at Isometric. It's about 30 people, and they're busy building software for verifiers, project developers, and some pathway specific software as well to make that verification and certification process hopefully go as smoothly as possible. And since we got started, we've now been endorsed by ICROA, ICDCM, have conditional CORSIA approval. I now have well over 100 developers kind of across the world working with us with offtakes from groups like Microsoft, Frontier, and many others. So excited to talk about the certification process, and I will pass over.
Thanks a lot, Neil. Patricia, you want to give us a small flavor of what CSI is doing and what your role here is?
Of course, thank you very much for having me and giving the opportunity to present CSI. I myself, I'm Patricia. I'm working at CSI since last year, January, and I'm the Global Biochar C-Sync Manager, so responsible for the industrial biochar certification when it comes to C-Syncs. C-Syncs or Thinks is our name that we call the credits, and we are, as the others, a standard-setting body for nature-based carbon removal solutions. To date, we have 500,000 biochar credits issued in our registry, making us the largest in this sector. And our product range goes from industrial biochar certification over C-Syncs with industrial biochar, artisanal biochar, tree and construction sinks, as well as a carbon balancing tool for farmers, for farming groups. We were founded in 2021, and it was a joint effort of the Ithaca Institute and the EasyCert Group. While Ithaca Institute is certainly a name that rings for most of you, it's a pioneering scientific institution in the field of carbon solutions, mainly biochar. They also are the head behind the EBC, and that's the go-to standard for biochar quality even today. The other strong partner is the holding company EasyCert Group. That's a fully independent, so no venture capital involved, company that has sustainability embedded in its DNA, and it comes with several decades of experience in certification schemes. Both sat together 4 years ago, and saw the problem of climate change and said, well, that's missing. We should found or we should include a standard setting body for carbon removals in our portfolio. And what makes us special is that we are scientifically sound and have a scientific sound carbon C-Sync certification. We have a very low barrier access, so we want to make the potential of or use the potential that biochar has, and that's the very decentralized, very circular economy based model, and that makes us also using the potential of the smallholder farmers that farm approximately 50% of the farmland globally, and therefore are a big leverage that we use and open with the artisan C-Sync standard. And also in the industrial level, we cover a wide range from a very small producer of a couple of 100 tons of biochar till the with all experienced project developer. And our system must be accessible for both of them and robust enough to serve both. And we do this with a very high focus on customer support. Yeah.
Thanks a lot for these introductions. Our aim today is to ensure that people that join us have a good understanding of the whole value chain and the journey from starting the projects until receiving a certification, and then also getting to know what kind of steps are in this process involved, what kind of entities, but also crucially what kind of steps. Patricia, since you had the last word, I would like to start with you. Maybe if you can give us a small overview where people would actually need to start when coming to that white space of starting with a CDR project, with an idea, with an opportunity at hand, where to start from a standard perspective, and what would be the best way to structure the beginning of that journey?
Sure. I think most people start thinking on a biochar project starting from the production of biochar, which is also a good starting point. We also order and organize our whole project documentation around biochar production. However, you should be aware that it's both a physical product that nobody knows, so you have to set up the market, as well as a C-Sync certification, a carbon removal certification that comes with its own rules. As was said before, it's totally based on trust, so it requires a lot of documentation. So in a carbon removal project or in a biochar carbon removal project, there are usually at least 3 distinct sectors involved. There's the biomass production and supply. That's the place where plants capture the CO2 from the atmosphere. There is the pyrolysis unit that creates the stabilization of the biomass carbon to biochar, and therefore is one key element of the project. And then there's also the integration into a marketable product and a market or a stable matrix. So the biochar needs to be applied somewhere to prevent the risk of the reversal of the CO2, so to safely store it. And these 3 sectors have to collaborate because it's essential to document all emissions from biomass production till application to this matrix. And even if each and every actor has limited influence on the others, all these steps are critical to verify a carbon sink. And therefore, I think a biochar producer must think about sustainable biomass supply, but they also have to do an analysis for possible sales of their biochar. And as I said, it's a new product. People don't really know it. So it's not even thinking about it, not only thinking about where to sell my biochar, but it's also what kind of products could I produce or partner with somebody who can produce a product that's actually of use for the people around me, the market, the buyers. And that's something that I also in discussions with potential biochar producers, that's always the biggest challenge that they tell me. And then if you have this set up, the next step would be to think about the right technology to actually serve this need, to think about how to include this technology in this area, where could you use your excess heat, for example. And then only, if that's all clear, then it's about the C-Sync project as well. So you have to have an off-taker for your C-Syncs. You have to think about all this documentation you have to do to provide this trust in the market, and partner with the MOE systems that actually provide you the service of documenting everything. So I hope that was a good overview about the challenges you face.
Yes, indeed. I really like that you pointed out the complexities at different scales that people need to work on, looking at the materials, the revenues, and the complexities of value chains that people need to look at for biochar project, but then also on the certification issue that determine how much revenues will be derived from carbon dioxide removal. Neil, when we look at that aspect of the journey that a producer goes through, specifically about the certification against CDR standards and methodologies, what are the things that project developers need to know ahead of certification when they engage with that subworld of the CDR operations, as Patricia had outlined before?
Yeah. I think the first comment is maybe actually similar to something Patricia commented on, but there is a physical side to all these companies, and then there is this informational side. And often that informational side is understandably one that many projects we work with have, maybe they come from reactor design or from a logistics background, or, quite often the project leads or the CEOs of these companies, their background is much more in the physical world. And so when it comes to the certification and suddenly you're looking at LCA information, counterfactuals, leakage, it's just a very different style of information gathering exercise, expertise that I think can take teams a bit of time to get their head around. And often they think it's going to be really easy to do something like an LCA, and hopefully it's not too painful. But an LCA is, it's quite a detailed exercise. And so I just think going into the experience with kind of that in mind, that there are going to be things that you maybe don't have the kind of prior expertise in, is something worth keeping in mind. The more general point on that, which maybe sounds almost boring and obvious, is just it's not a small task to get through certification. Um, you should be prepared to have someone close to like a full-time employee kind of managing this process for the very first time that you go through it. The goal is everyone gets easier, but again, as much of your product that you're selling is the certification as is the physical thing because of how the markets work today. So, we often see companies where they have 50 people just focused on the hardware and a quarter of their chief of staff focused on certification. I think that's going to lead to some challenges if you want to get through the process quickly. The other two things I had in mind are maybe a bit selfish, but the first one is just communicating the actual timelines to us and the verifier as like clearly as you can. We have often got, 2 months into a validation process, and suddenly we're told we've promised our buyers credits in the next 2 months. Um, great, good for them. It definitely causes some heartburn on everyone's side. And, I think just going into the process, being as transparent with the registry and the verifier about what you are trying to do so they can give you input about how feasible those timelines are is important, not just from a reducing everyone's heartburn perspective, but, if you have obligations to your buyers, the earlier they get information, if there are going to be changes to timelines, the better. And then final selfish ask, but hopefully this is useful for projects as well, is you can ask people things if you have uncertainties. So, again, a lot of people we work with, their expertise is more in the physical process, as it should be. But, we have 15 people on a science team and, 5 people on our registry operations team who their sole job is to help answer clarification questions and help you understand the protocol requirements better. So if there are areas that you are uncertain about, how does counterfactual storage apply to my situation? Am I doing my geochemical tests in compliance with the protocol? It's kind of our professional job to help answer those questions, and typically we'll get back to you in 48 hours with any clarifications. So yeah, do just feel free to ask because this can be a big process.
Thanks. And I really like that you highlighted communication, because I feel like especially in the CDR space where there's new standards that are younger and that are more vital compared to, let's say, the older space where large standards were slowly. I feel like at the moment the CDR space is more agile and more quick, and I think that's where communication plays a vital role. Benny, when we talk about communication, I would be curious from your view is basically from a standard perspective, what would you require project suppliers to interact? How can they help you in order to deliver the services that a standard provides in a more efficient and better focused way itself as well?
Yeah, thanks. Very good question. And interestingly, my answers are going to be very similar to what Neil and Patricia have just said, but maybe from the other perspective from our side. Timelines is definitely something we're seeing quite often. That just what Neil said, we've got a supplier, as we call them, or a project developer coming our way. We're going through the full process, and all of a sudden, we get the exact same thing that Neil says. Issuance needs to be in 4 weeks' time, and that's really, really important to understand that what we standards are trying to do is to give coming back to what I said earlier, to give the credible trustworthiness that a carbon credit needs, right? Because one thing we shouldn't forget is that a carbon credit, like, it's intangible. Like, that is the proof of what you've been doing in terms of like something invisible and intangible. So it lives by nothing else but trust. So we really need to make sure that we give this trust by following the processes, by following processes that are required by, for example, ICROA or ICBCM when it comes to third-party audits. There's quite a lot of things that need to be done. And I fully agree with what Neil said and Patricia, also purely on that is not easy. It is not always an easy task to go through a carbon project. Just because you are a good producer of biochar, for example, you're not automatically a good carbon project developer, because it's not so much about what you do, but much more about what can you prove that you're doing? How can you prove that you're doing these things in a specific way? Where are emissions caused? Because we need to subtract them from the eventual issuance volume. So there is quite a different universe of rules, and some of those maybe not always being intuitive, and some of those maybe sometimes being a bit annoying, meaning that we as standards are in quite an interesting spot where we're trying to be your best friends as suppliers, but also the quite evil, brutal ones that keep telling you you can't do this way because then you're not going to pass an audit. You can't do this that way because then you're not going to get emissions of carbon credit. All of it always having in mind that what we want you to do is to be able to grow by getting the trust of buyers to use our carbon credits. So we are a bit in a bit of an interesting role there, where yeah we want to support you as much as possible, but we need an understanding from the carbon markets, from the projects, who are the ones that are actually doing the carbon removal of our processes. And I think one maybe a bit more tangible item is similar to what my fellow panelists have said. One thing being just having a person dedicated to carbon removal. The other one is also just understanding early enough that the complexities may require partnering with a DMRV partner, for example, to just say, if I'm a relatively small scale, I don't know, biochar project in Indonesia, I'm just making it up right now. It may not be super easy to set up an entire repetitive DMRV system, because it's one thing to deliver data for once for one audit, but if you're aiming to get to multiple issuances per year, you really need to have a way to reproduce data in a highest quality way. And this is definitely something that there are quite a lot of partners in the market, Future being one of them. It's not a shame to be using those. We heavily rely on DMRV partners as well, and we think it's that there are different partners with different strengths, which is why it's very important that we build a trustworthy ecosystem. That being maybe the main tangible item I would suggest people to use.
Thanks. And maybe that brings me to one question that I had to the three of you. You mentioned standards having the role of being the brutal and hard stakeholder to give flags to people to indicate that they are not eligible due to a certain point. If you look at the, let's call it graveyard of projects that have applied and have not went forward, I would be keen to get a sense from all of you, basically what the largest or the looming pitfalls of a project are, that when they start engaging with you, they proceed. If you have a sense of what kind of barriers have they encountered, and maybe that can give the audience a good of sense of what to look for specifically when entering onto that journey of certification. Patricia, since you started, can I give the honor to you to take the first step, but also inviting the two colleagues to jump in whenever they want to.
Yeah, I think we're repeating ourselves the whole time, because I think we just heard what are the biggest challenges. It's that even so people do a wonderful job, they can't prove what they did, or they think, or they don't treat the verification of these things with the priority that it should have. So then I know companies that didn't even read the standard itself, so the methodology. And I think this is like the basic point. Yeah, you should start with reading what will be the requirements that you will be facing. And yeah, I can't emphasize this more. This is a whole new business area that you are entering, and therefore it also requires the responses, or the yes. And besides this, I think there's also other projects that fail because there is the problem of finding a use case for the biochar. We saw this as well, that people produce biochar and then they couldn't find somewhere to use it. They couldn't find somewhere to actually generate a stable C-sync out of it, and then it's also lost. Handing over to the others, maybe I will have other thoughts and then add at the end again.
Yeah, very happy to. Neil, do you want to take it first? I can happily go as well.
Yep, go for it.
I think I literally wrote down as a first thing proof of end use. So I think it's both. Either where do you get your biomass from, or where do you put it? Like that's a massive thing. It's we've seen quite often underestimations on how complex it is to find somebody to take your biochar. I mean, sticking with the example of biochar because it's maybe the most the most mature methodology in the market. We've had over the last couple of years, it was more than 1,600 projects going through the pipeline that we've been reviewing. And whilst it may be easy to just get a sack of biochar with 500 kilos, somewhere to get somebody to use it, scaling that up to 50,000, 100 or 200,000 tons per annum, that is quite a challenge. And not just doing that, but also doing that in a financially sustainable way and doing that in a way where not always just one end user would use all your biochar, but you might be forced to use 15,000 different ones. So how do you track the logistics? How do you let us know what emissions are being caused on the way there? How do we make sure that, coming back to the classic standard example, some end user would use it as barbecue coal, which is just sort of the plain one, but an interesting use case is also what if a tree nursery uses your biochar in pots, and those pots eventually end up in a dustbin, and the dustbin goes into the incineration of the municipality. So there's quite a lot of details that are very often underestimated. Coming back to just because you can produce biochar in a very good way does not automatically mean that this is definitely applicable for a biochar project. But Neil, happy to hear your thoughts as well.
I'm unfortunately going to continue the train of maybe giving an answer that is somewhat pathway specific. So apologies in advance for any DAC companies on the line. I imagine most people listening probably touch rocks or plants. So I think to try and give some more detailed answers, if you're working with kind of geochemical pathways, I think the biggest stumbling block that we have often seen is making sure that the team expertise matches that. So, a lot of project developers, I think, see these as logistics-based projects, but actually MRV for an open system pathway like enhanced weathering is just substantially more of the work and effort that the companies need to do than it may be in another pathway like direct air capture. And so there, I think, you either need to have geochemical expertise on hand or even better on staff, because that side of the equation is actually very non-trivial to getting through the certification process. And then on the plant side, and this is, I guess, relevant for biochar, but more generally any biker's pathway, it's quite rare that we come across a project developer who hasn't thought about sustainability, which is great. Sustainable biomass, necessary condition, but not sufficient. And I think it's rarer, again, getting back to this point on like MRV mindset, carbon accounting mindset, it's rarer that we come across project developers who have thought about, all the leakage implications of their biomass and how they might demonstrate that they're using a true waste product. Though that's still somewhat common. When you get to things like counterfactual storage, at that point, I think actually quite an infrequent number of project developers have really started to think about that kind of consideration because it's a very carbon accounting style one. And if you're a project developer in the biker space and you've set up a supply chain and you're using, medium-sized forest thinnings that would have been piled, there's actually potentially quite a large challenge from a carbon accounting perspective of using those. And so, again, and I think this is something Benno and Patrizia had mentioned, it maybe sounds bland, but before you go and structure key parts of your logistics network, having read the requirements and the protocols to understand how are you actually going to flow through that whole process end to end, I think that can sometimes trip companies up.
Yes, thanks. And I agree that the methodologies are a vital part to be familiar with. There are obviously companies that support the development of projects. There are companies that support the monitoring, reporting, and verification. So I would be curious, and maybe Neil, since you brought that point up initially, would be curious to start with you, maybe from your perspective. how relevant are MRV and other service providers from your perspective to project developers to complement the expertise that they have or might not have? And what do you think is, at what stage should project developers also engage with these? And maybe starting from your perspective and then also handing this over to Benno as well.
I think I agree a lot with something Benno said, which is a lot of the companies that fill in this kind of either data gathering or supervisory function can be incredibly helpful. We work with some companies who just on the data side, have tried to spin up their own internal data system and management tools. Some of them can do that. But again, if your core competency is moving CO2 out of the air and putting it underground, that's quite a different core competency to kind of building a data management pipeline. And so there, we work a lot with companies like Mangrove or Cooler, who are there to actually help kind of aggregate that data. And then, I mean, there's another reason that I think it can be helpful because as registries, we care about, MRV related data. But you as a project, you actually care about a lot more of an expansive set of data. You care about operational data because you want to tweak your pyrolysis plant to, maximize yields. I guess from a registry perspective, your yields are not the most material thing. It's kind of your emissions. And so if you want to be tracking all of that style of data, a registry, however good the platform Isometric is built for, taking data to credits, it's not there to help you tweak the process efficiency of your plant. And so I think there as well, you can get people who can really step in. I think one thing that's newer, but we are seeing, I guess to the point that everyone on the panel has mentioned about just the challenge of getting through some of these processes, we're seeing more companies like Offstream, I guess, as one example, pop up to help support the actual PDD development. PDD writing, getting through the certification is a skill and an expertise. And so again, I think if you're working with someone who has done that multiple times, that can also help prepare you. In terms of when to engage, I think from the registry perspective, we will engage with a project at almost any stage of maturity. Obviously, what that engagement looks like can be quite different. If it's a, back of a napkin plan for a project, maybe we can help give you some tips and tricks like we're doing on this call about what you should be thinking about. If you've actually got your kind of pilot up and running, or you have started to broker your first kind of forward contracts, I think at that point we can start getting much more into the weeds about, okay, what would the timelines here look like? What data streams are you going to have? And kind of take things from there.
Okay, thanks. That's interesting. I think one of the key points that also repeatedly comes up when discussing emerging projects is obviously the economic perspective. Is basically what's the price, what's determining the price of the corks or the C-Things or the credits that we obtain, and also what's driving the certification costs. And I think that would be, especially on the first point, is how do we determine prices as the key revenue factor? That might be interesting to learn for some of the participants here. And maybe Benno, since you are working with Nasdaq and if the cork price index regularly published, I'll be curious to get your insights in terms of how to determine revenues and what kind of factors would drive the price of the corks that people obtain from your view.
Yes, very happy to. I mean, obviously, I don't have a glass bowl to look into and don't have the perfect recipe to tell everybody how to exactly determine their prices. But one thing, Hannes, you already mentioned is the Cork X index that we've been publishing for a couple of years right now, which comes from Nasdaq, which is basically our aim to try and make visible what spot prices for the next 180 days people have been paying specifically for biochar. We in the Cork X index are mixing all the different methodologies in them. We will start breaking out the different pricing points per methodology once there's enough deals so you can't back engineer to exactly understand what a specific project had what price in there. We think it's incredibly important to understand both for buyers what is a fair price for us to buy, but also for the suppliers what is a fair price for us to sell. So that's something where we've seen quite good trends where we see, I actually haven't checked it recently, but I think we are trending somewhere at around 150 euros in biochar as of now. Some things that definitely will influence the pricing. I mean, starting with just going to a standard and registry and get your credits third-party certified. I think that's likely something you might be interested in, otherwise you wouldn't have been listening for the last half an hour in here. There are absolutely some buyers that might be investors in very novel, innovative, kinds of projects that may not yet require any third-party verification. That is fine, but on the larger scale, certainly buyers will look for categories. Buyers will be looking for de-risking tools, I would argue. A de-risking tool is certainly a third-party verification and a certification, but also choosing standards to certify your projects that have the international accreditations that are endorsed by the big endorsement bodies. Just be aware that these things that help you get a bit higher value to your carbon credits also come with the expectation of delivering. I mean, it's plainly bureaucracy. You need a lot more bureaucracy. You need a lot more audits, a lot more data to be shared. So it's not just that this brings price. That also comes with quite a lot of process and quite a lot of work to be done. I would also argue that certainly proficient DMRV practices will definitely help you just make visible what the costs are that you're having. Just deliver a professional view on why do we actually charge not 7 euros per ton, but 150, or in various methodologies, 400, 500, 600 euros per ton. If you can show with data to your investors why the investment is needed, and also how that investment helps you scale down the prices in future, that is certainly one of the key paths to making your buyers happy. One instant lever that you also have is, I would argue, the timing of when you certify versus the timing of when you buy, because clearly the longer away your first issuance is, and the longer it takes for your first delivery to be due, that will certainly have an impact on the expectations of the buyers to buy from you. So certainly there will be a slightly higher risk, hence a slightly lower price. A model that we've seen quite successful for some was to start with a relatively small auditing facility, a test facility in the case of biochar, doing a couple 100 tons a year, which is not a crazy big investment in maybe in absolutes, but relative to the market, to help you understand how does that process work, how can I see where I've got deficiencies, where I need to improve my processes, use that as a proof that you are capable of getting one of your projects certified, and then also just negotiate deals on scale-ups of that very facility. That's been a model we've seen quite successful in the recent past. Not always the easiest one, takes you a lot of time, takes a lot of patience, and means that you might not be able to directly monetize your first very projects. Yeah, but maybe that's a couple of first thoughts on that.
Thanks a lot. I will move us a bit further towards the questions that have been raised. We have received quite a number of questions, which we're compiling here. I have a lot of questions are looking still on a commercial side of things, but less on the prices, but more on the volume and thresholds that are relevant. Patricia, I think I would be keen to hear from you, especially since you've got two distinct standards that are also looking at different size and types of projects under your belt. I would be keen to hear a bit from you what you consider maybe as a rough size in terms of what does a financially viable volume would be for a project. For example, there's a reference about a project with 2,000 tons. Is there a rule of thumb or not? How can people go forward when looking at what the minimum scale for a project would be?
Sure. For us, it's one thing that drives us forward is to open C-Sync certification and thus C-Sync or carbon removal remuneration to everyone. As I said in the beginning, I think that's especially if we look at biochar, that's one of the key elements, that biochar is a technology that you can use very decentralized, and that actually doesn't require that you gather a lot of biomass at one place, but you can have relatively small biochar or pyrolysis units that are financially viable. We have a great price calculator on our web page that's that I also shared in the chat, that's for us, of course, for CSI, and it's not showing the prices of isometric or puro, but there you can see that also with pretty small, so a couple of 100 tons of biochar, you're on a good side. And what is relevant for us as well is that, of course, if there's a smaller project, there's also less risks included with it, and therefore we are aiming for a certification scheme or for a verification scheme where these risks are assessed and part of also the bureaucracy, for example, that you have to bring. And so this being said for the industrial side, so actually there is no limit for CSI. And then as you also gave me the bridge to the artisanal standard, I think that's exactly where we see a big potential. And to be honest, the most credits in our registry are artisanal credits, because there is, as I said at the beginning, a huge number of smallholder farmers around. And the challenge is how to include these in a certification scheme, and to make them profit from the climate service that they are actually providing. And we came up with a system. The system includes a C-Sync manager that includes that has field officers employed that then go to each and every artisanal C-Sync producer. And artisanal C-Sync producers, if I'm saying this, then I'm speaking about people who own, let's say, a hectare or even only a few acres of land, and use the biochar within their, or use very simple production technologies to produce biochar. But there has been a lot of research on this specific technologies. If there's producers that come up with different ones, then they have to undergo a thorough test of their emissions, for example. And then going back to the smallholders, field officers will train them in how to use it, how to use a biochar in their fields. The biochar will most probably lead to higher yields, because smallholders are often in tropical areas where we have very acidic soils, and biochar has the best effect. So that means they can produce more more biomass on their fields, that then in turn can be used to produce biochar again. And why should these, that each of them contributes a little bit only, but if you gather them, there's a huge potential. And we set up the system that actually gets them involved, gets them paid for the climate service, and on a side effect also increases their livelihoods. So yeah, these are the two options. So on the industrial side, there is actually no limit to the downside, but to the lower end. But of course, if it's only a few tons of biochar, then it's not worth going through all this effort. And for the artisanal ones, it's even possible to group people, to group producers, and then have a huge project made out of very many artisanal producers.
All right. Thanks, Patricia. Maybe Neil, I would be curious also on your view on this, both on times on size, but then also in terms of when people have determined that the project has the necessary size. At what stage should they engage with your project? So at what time should the biochar company reach out to a certification company? Should the communication begin during the project planning, the building, or the commissioning of the plant? Maybe you can give us a small view from your experiences what the best timing is, but then also what the best scale would be for such a company to approach.
I think on the scale question, I don't have that much of a different answer to you, Patricia. We also work with a lot of projects who are doing what Benno mentioned, where they are starting with a kind of pilot, one pyrolysis facility or a couple of fields, or some kind of smaller scale pilot, and then seeing if that goes well. Often that's more from testing out the commercial traction than it is going through the certification process. If you are a new company and you invest all this capex in a 10,000 ton a year project, 100,000 ton a year project, you really want to know that there's kind of going to be someone on the other side. I would say what that does mean, though, is if you're a project and you are at the scale of, 1,000 tons a year, I think if there's not a pathway for you to scale up your operation significantly, then, to somewhere between 10, 100,000 a year, I think it might be challenging to find buyers on the other side, just because there are transaction costs involved with all these deals. And so, often off-takers are wanting to do a certain amount of deals. And obviously, if they have a certain, size threshold, it's useful for them to buy that from somewhat, medium or larger developers. The one caveat to that would be if you're looking at the spot market, everyone would love credits. There aren't that many credits out there today. So if you're kind of willing to take that kind of risk, then I think the smaller projects can also work there. On the timings, yeah, I guess kind of harking back to a previous answer, we will typically be able to get more seriously involved either around when the project is coming together on the ground or you're going through your first commercial discussions with buyers. Isometric has this buyer pays business model where we don't charge project developers, we charge kind of buyers of credits. And so what that means is, if you are negotiating your first purchases, it can be helpful for us to kind of be involved and kind of talk to the buyer. And it also gives a chance for them to ask any kind of technical or MLV related questions as well. And then we can kind of give a more third party view on that question. So yeah, I think we are happy to speak to projects in earlier stage as well. But, back to what I said previously, there it might just be sharing kind of best practices, things they should keep in mind, versus kind of more pragmatic details about, how to draft or how to approach different sections of your PDD.
Cool. Thanks. Interesting. Maybe to wrap up the section around prices, which are related to the minimum scale of projects and the amount. Another question was submitted by Leslie Ducommun, which looks at the quality of the carbon credits, which obviously is also a determination then on the prices that you can get. Benne, maybe you can give us a small indication also from your perspective on what the quality of the carbon credits, what's the driver behind the quality of the carbon credits, and then also how this reflects to maybe high quality, low quality project size necessities.
Yeah, that's a good one, and also one that you could spend like the entire evening on, because theoretically what we're trying to do, or what we're doing in practice, is we are commoditizing to an extent, we are categorizing to an extent, meaning that if you get the stamp of approval of having passed one of the methodologies, then you are as good or as bad as all the other ones that receive the same stamp. I think quality is also not a universal truth in one or the other way. What we prove with certifying you is that we can tell that you've used a very detailed, very rigorous methodology that has been checked against by us, by an auditor, by us again doing the double check of the auditor quality and have issued that. But in that sense, you are still, as said, as good or as bad as anyone else. Some projects choose, if they are getting asked to have their the credits rated by rating agencies. That is something that some find helpful, and I think if anything that helps buyers understand, risk and just supports buyer decision making is very much supported on our side. On the other hand, it's also really important. Like basically anything around selling is about selling your story right. So a very brilliant project might just not be very good at selling because they might not be able to highlight the strengths of the very project, or just maybe pitch the wrong the wrong benefits because it's not sort of tailor-made to the listener, whereas a project that maybe has a little bit higher methane emissions during the production of biochar might just be able to sell it a bit better and thus be more successful. So I think quality of the project, there needs to be definitely minimum quality, that is very clear, and otherwise you would never pass any of the standards that are represented here on stage. But added on top of that, I would argue there is not this one quality. It very strongly depends on what you're trying to do. And I want to add maybe just a little bit of a very personal opinion on this. When we are trying to use carbon credits to compensate for emissions, that's once again me personally now thinking this. My personal view of this is that it's very important not to mix up co-benefits with carbon removal. It is super important to have co-benefits, and it's super important to have as many SDGs. I mean, it's very, very suitable and very helpful to have as many sustainable development goals met as possible. but that doesn't really change the impact purely on climate and purely on the removal of the carbon that one seeks to compensate with. So that is also a pitfall that some might be falling into, to say, if I'm just doing the SDG hunting and just add a couple of more extra SDGs on top, am I automatically getting higher prices? That is, I would argue, not automatically the case, but it will likely increase the cost of just getting these things verified. So maybe not as easy as wished for a binary answer, but hopefully somewhat useful.
Thanks. That makes a lot of sense. We have another question, which I like because it's getting much more technical, from Bobby Levine, who asked us, it seems like some standards differentiate between biochar that has an HC org ratio below 0.4 versus below 0.7. So Patricia, I know that you're quite familiar with different qualities of biochar that are produced. So I was curious to get your views on what are the pros and cons of distinction and the relevance of the HC org benchmark from your perspective.
Sure, thank you very much for this question. H to C ratio gives us an indication about the degree of carbonization of biochar. So we at Carbon Standards, as well as Puro, uses the 0.7 metric to distinguish biochar from different materials that have not been fully carbonized, for example. So this 0.7 value is to determine whether what you have in front of you is actually biochar or whether it can't be considered as biochar. And then we have this other magic number, which is even more magic. It's the H2C organic ratio below 0.4. And that's an indicator for the stability of biochar. If biochar consists out of different hydrocarbons, you have some that are more aliphatic, so they are a line where you have C's and H's, so you have more H, and these are prone to decay, while you have others that are polyaromatic carbon fraction, that is that are every polyaromatic carbons that have more than 7 rings that have proven to be stable towards biogenic decay. And so this value gives you an idea about how is your biochar structured. If your H2C ratio is low, you know that you have more of this polyaromatic carbon fraction, and it will persist longer in a soil, which means that if it's below 0.4, we can assume that 75% of the biochar is stable and only 25% of it can be degraded. And so for all biochars that are below this value, we know this conservative approach that we know at least 75% will be stable. For all biochars that are above 0.4, this is not clear, and we as at Carbon Standards consider all of it to be degradable. And therefore this number is so important. And then based on this, there is, related to this topic, there is conversations and research going on for other indicators. There is the random reflectance measurements that are discussed currently. There is HiPi methodology to look at how is your biochar structured, and all of this is relevant to understand how much of the biochar is permanent and how much will be degraded if applied to soil.
Thanks, Patricia. I think one question I had, which I found interesting, was submitted by Benedikt Zimmermann, who was looking at standard conversions and especially on methodology conversions. So, and maybe this question can go to all three of you, is basically, are we going to see a harmonization of various standards and create timelines, but also the methodologies themselves converging a bit closer within the near future? And I would be keen to get your maybe brief snapshot of what you think might happen in the future. Maybe, Neil, I can start with you, since you were the last person that did not speak.
I'm going to give the incredibly informative answer of maybe and no. So I do think from the VCM perspective, I think there should be a bit more a bit more convergence in the near future than there has been in the past. And then registries are going to have to do more of their work on things like speed of deliverability, reliability of deliverability, those kinds of areas. And I would say I actually don't have full confidence that transition is going to go all the way to the extent there are completely homogenous requirements. But I do think project developers will see one, closer requirements there are today, and at least like closer styles of requirements. So maybe registries maintain some differences in particular areas, but at least we're all targeting the same, counterfactual questions or geochemical questions. The reason I said no is I actually don't think the international and policy scene and regulation environment right now is pushing towards harmonization. I, in some ways, think it's pushing the opposite way. The CRCF methodologies in Europe, I think it's very unlikely to think that those are going to have the exact same requirements as the Japanese GTX requirements, as Canadian requirements, as Brazilian requirements, not even to mention Article 6. And so I do think that, it might be the case that if you're a project developer in a given country, from the voluntary perspective, your work is a bit easier, or from the domestic perspective, there's if you're trying to sell into a compliance market, things are actually very homogenized at that point. But I think if you're looking at kind of future cross-border transactions, I think actually we might still see a reasonable amount of fragmentation between what different countries end up kind of putting emphasis on.
Thanks. It was much more elaborated than just maybe and no. Benno, curious on what your two keywords would be in that sense and how you would substantiate it.
Can I leave it with just maybe just no and not give the the detail? No, I'm just kidding. I actually agree very much so with Neil. I think it's important that we've got a couple of key milestones that we all agree on, and maybe focusing now on CSI, isometric, and Pura, for example. Well, I think it's important that there are different. It's fair and important that there are different registries, different methodologies with different maybe focal areas, and trying to harmonize them may also be just a bit early in the market and force ourselves not to be able to just deliver specificities that may make one or the other stronger in one case, which may be very useful for one or the other supplier. I think it also gives us the chance to be disruptive, to be quick, to be flexible, to move with latest science. That said, I think it's very important that we agree on key items, and we've just had, I think it was last week, a cross registry and cross methodological workshop of permanence to understand what are the views of everyone. So clearly it shouldn't be the Wild West where everybody decides entirely on their own what science is, because eventually we all believe in science, even though these days it's not always always clear across all boards. But as long as we all believe in science, we should eventually at least come to a relatively similar conclusion of how and what carbon should be removed. But I do agree with Neil that I don't see a super quick convergence and a super quick harmonization of the markets. It's at least when we look into the next, let's say, 5 to 10 years.
Mm-hmm. Patrizia, how about you? Do you think that can also be a very quick yes, no, maybe answer?
It's a yes. It's the answer to. I couldn't agree more with Neil and Benno. The only thing I could add is that probably I don't see interchangeability between the registries of these standard bodies. What I can imagine is that CRCF will set the basic rules for Europe. If we have a very Europe focused view right now, then I think CRCF will set the basic rules, and then we can have the nuances by the different standards bodies. So there will be a focus area there, and there will be other focus area at the other standard body, and this will be, so the basics will be aligned, but then there will be details that are different.
Thanks. Okay, everyone, I think we are right at time, which speaks for a lively debate, which I found very refreshing. Thanks a lot for everyone for joining and submitting all your great questions. We're going to make this webinar available as a video recording to all of you who signed up. You'll receive it via email. And you can also sign up for more newsletters or other updates that we supply to you regularly. Just scan the QR code or just join us on our website. And obviously, if you have further questions, just reach out to Carbon Future. We either respond to them ourselves with our knowledge, or we can also make sure we can get you in contact with the respective persons at the different standards and registries, so you can directly interact with them. But for now, I wish all of you a great afternoon, morning, evening, wherever you are. And hopefully you enjoyed that and have a good take-home message on the diversity of the different challenges along the supply and project development journey that we learned about. Thanks a lot, everyone.